are examples of if you want to have modes of consciousness that are able to operate unmediated by a compressing mechanism like capital, because it makes everything understandable in terms of capital. That's why people like it. Because I know, oh, you work at Amazon. I work at a wedding day. We know each other. Great. It gives you a feeling of intelligibility, which if you can't handle the fullness of a human life, then that's the best you can do. Well, to handle the fullness of a better life, you've got to be trained by a new metal, elders, institutions, and family to be actually open to the other. It's like Levinas. Right. You've been talking about Levinas. If you want to have the infinite versus the totality per se, there's a whole lot of work. This is psychoanalysis. This is Lacan. Like, you can't simply free people from mechanisms of compression and expect them not to kill themselves, right? But here's the problem. So capitalism goes, yep, so don't complain. Get over it because you'll just eat yourself. But then it's like, but you're destroying the middle classes. Wages are in an inverse relationship with profit, and we have all these issues. And capitalism's like, well, what else are you going to do? The key is to create a social coordination testing mechanism by which people can see different modes of consciousness in the good. And then that offers a way that dialectically works with the pricing mechanism where you are able to avoid being reduced to the logic of capital and that mode of consciousness, and actually are then able to have the utility functions of the pricing mechanism without the mode of consciousness that leads to reductionism. So then the following question becomes this. All right, well, what is the beautiful by which I would think would be an indication of the way that people should live? Because there's a testing now, right? Okay, all right. So everyone has different ideas of the good beyond utility, the good life. Right? Philosophy is all about the good life, right? All right. People have different ideas of what that is, right?
Right.
Okay. The question would be, what are the qualities? Please.
And a lot of those ideas are bullshit. This is like a constant problem that comes up with students. You're like, okay, but people won't agree. And it's like, yeah. And in fact, a lot, like the overwhelming majority of us, we should assume are wrong about probably most things, and we're part of that. So yes, okay. So keep going. Yeah, I just wanted to put in our differences in ideas about the good also are differences in the fact that there's a democracy of opinions, and those opinions are mostly bullshit. Yeah.
Well, but the issue is that without an expansive mode of consciousness, you don't even have the capacity to know that it's BS. You don't have the capacity to see that, so you're locked in this bubble of thinking, what is the good life? And because you don't have an ability to see beyond it, because you would need models, you would need coordination, you'd need ways of testing it that were not overly attacking, because if people are overly aggressive, then you get defensive and it all blows up, right? You need a way of indirectly showing, then talking through, not debating the contradiction that you and Mikey well, the Nick Land conversation is a great example of a model of what it looks like to show a good conversation, the kind of conversation you'd expect to see in the good life without moralizing about it, right? Because if you want to show people the good life, you can't tell them the good life because that's oppressive, neurotic, and authority-based. You show them with a shine that attracts them into doing it themselves, and then they own it as their own in their own particular customization. That's the key to attraction, is it brings people to a similarity, but they simultaneously customize it as they're brought into that similarity. Thus, it does not become totalizing or flattening because there's an individuation. Like a way that Dante or Creech or different put it is that the more you approach the beautiful, it is not that you become some neutered, non-human, you become more human. Blue becomes more like beautiful. People become more like people. You become more like yourself as you approach the good. And yet in that particularity, since everyone who is orbiting that with you comes closer to their own particularity, there is a harmony in that creates a oneness that is not reducible to a sameness, like the harmony of a Beethoven's Ninth. Beethoven's Ninth is possible precisely because the instruments are not the same, because they are different, because they do different things. But when they come together, they can generate something that is not reducible to the sum of their parts, right? And this is where, when we talk about the transcendent, it's very important. Like the transcendent in a manner that is not a spurious infinity, but a true infinity in Hegel would be something like Beethoven's Ninth. Beethoven's Ninth is transcendent from the violin. It is transcendent from the piano. And yet it is not possible without them, right? And it's not also possible without the relation between all of the instruments. And it's also not possible without each individual musician doing the practice and work to be able to play at that quality, right? You bring all of those variables together in a particular time, in a particular place, with a particular commitment, something can arise that is not reducible to the parts, that has to be experienced to get, okay? Like if I told you about Beethoven's Ninth, or if I showed you the seat music, this is Beethoven's Ninth, would you really get Beethoven's Ninth? No, you have to hear it, which means you require people to have certain commitments to make it possible. Classically speaking, and I think this gets to what Studebaker was saying about the good, the capital G good being transcendent of presupposition, something you find. It's the belief that actually the good is something like Beethoven's Ninth, that requires a certain bringing together of variables and experiences that is possible in this life, that suggests something that no individual can just automatically have, and yet is also not possible without them, but it requires a commitment, a willing to relate with other people, and to give your life over to something that seems silly. It seems kind of silly to spend a whole lot of time getting really good at a violin, right? There's no guarantee of money. Even if you get in an orchestra, are you going to be able to pay for everything on that? Probably not, unless you are the highest level, right? So there's a kind of absurdity to it. And yet, because of that absurdity, because of the willingness to practice and to come to this place, something can come forth that when people hear it in the audience, if it is a truly great experience of Beethoven's Ninth, does anyone in the audience say, oh, this is only my subjective idea of the good? Does anyone say this is just my preference? Truly great art screams at you, this is good, whether you like it or not. And it comes forth. Now, you have to do the work to condition yourself to be able to understand Beethoven's Ninth or the music or James Joyce. You can't just automatically necessarily get it. But the key is that the good in this sense is not relative, but conditional. A lot of people talk about objective, relative. I think the correct category is conditional. There are certain conditions that have to be met for the highest good to come forth that is not reducible to utility, but it is also not merely relevant, relative, or subjective, because it comes into existence when people meet certain conditions because of certain commitments that they realize is worth doing, okay? This notion of the good, which is transcendent but not in a spurious way, it's an irreducibility. This is precisely the kind of experience people need to have to know that there are different modes of consciousness from capital that will change their behavior, ideas of the rational, the idea of how to allocate their time, that will change their behaviors in the system, that until this technology has not been readily available for people to see or to participate in because the restrictions of capital, money, and time and geography were too high, right? And so what has happened is, in a sense, we got the pricing mechanism too early. We got the mechanism of allocating resources too early before we had the social mechanism that could train us to use that mechanism without being trained into a mode of consciousness that would lead to a capital nation state that's auto-cannibalistic, right? But now we have that. And now we just have to have the faithful presence to organize ourselves according to it. And there are many, and it ultimately requires that commitment to doing the work of that shine and showing. But in doing that, you model and show people a different mode of consciousness that is so needed if they're going to avoid being trained by capitalism into a capital that then ironically eats the whole thing auto-cannibalistically. But please.
Hey, yeah!